We left off in the last video with McClellan just outside of Richmond with about 86,000 men ready to attack. Lee at that point had absorbed heavy losses, and McClellan really could have ended the war, probably, at that point. Yet he did not pursue him. Remember, McClellan would always ask for more men, but just hesitate to pursue the offensive. And so, again, the war might have ended if McClellan had pursued Lee, but he didn't. So, in prolonging the war, Lincoln was actually able to get rid of slavery and eventually, of course, the Confederate States of America as well. But McClellan's performance greatly dismayed Lincoln, and so Lincoln reduced his authority by putting him under another general. And this general, Henry Halleck, actually called off the Peninsula Campaign. And so while McClellan was regrouping the army, Lee took the offensive. And Lee was hoping to just deliver a dramatic blow to the enemy. And so Lee marched rapidly around defenses in Washington, D.C., knowing that if he didn't strike quick, the South would be defeated by the weight of the superior resources of the North. And so his march was halted at Antietam Creek in Maryland on September 17th. 1862. And here, Generals Robert E. Lee and George McClellan faced off at Antietam Creek. This is near Sharpsburg, or it's in Sharpsburg, Maryland. And this is the first battle of the Civil War that was fought on northern soil. And so McClellan, again, did not use his numerical superiority to crush Lee's army, which he could have. But he was able to check the Confederate advance into the North. And so after a string of Union defeats, this tactical victory for the Union provided Lincoln with the political cover that he needed to issue his Emancipation Proclamation. And of course, this was released January 1st, 1863, and basically, Lincoln freed the slaves with this proclamation. Keep in mind that the South had not lost the war. They had not surrendered. They considered themselves to still be a part of the Confederate States of America. But historians say that Lincoln gave this or issued this proclamation in order to inspire the Northern troops who were war-weary at this point to keep on fighting. They felt like this was something that they could fight for. And so though the result of the battle was somewhat inconclusive, it was a tactical victory by the North. It was the bloodiest single day in American history with more than 22,000 casualties. If you think at 9/11, there were 3,000. And so this was 22 to 23,000 people dead. More deaths than in the War of 1812, the Mexican War, and the Spanish-American War combined. And yet again, though, McClellan failed to pursue Lee and to follow up his victory. And so Lincoln once again dismissed him. The draft. We all know that a draft basically selects people to do something with or without their consent. And in this case, the draft came in the form of the Conscription Act in March 1863. And it actually resulted in draft riots in several northern cities. And the most serious of these took place in New York in July of 1863. And most of these rioters were like urban workers who opposed conscription and the idea of fighting to free slaves, partly because they believed that free slaves would come to the North and take their jobs. So the New York riot began as a protest against conscription and became an assault on blacks, pretty much. And so the Emancipation Proclamation neither reflected nor initiated a change in white attitudes. Most white Northerners continued to believe in the inferiority of blacks. And even Lincoln was not an exception to this. But by this point, his views were beginning to change. They were evolving. Both slaves and free blacks regarded the Emancipation Proclamation as a promise for future improvement, even though it failed to liberate a single slave or even ease racial tensions. the blacks saw it as hope for the future. And Lincoln's racial views may have seemed unenlightened by modern standards, but even his most militant black contemporaries respected him. And after January 1st, 1863, when the proclamation was released, slaves flocked to the Union lines in droves to fight for the Union Army. So by 1862, the North needed more men to fight. And so they actually had to change a law that had been passed in 1792 that barred blacks from serving in the Army. And so after the Emancipation Proclamation, they authorized the enlistment of blacks, and states began to recruit black soldiers. So by the end of the war, 1 out of 8 Union soldiers was black. And blacks fought in segregated units that were commanded by white officers. And even though they initially received only about half of what white soldiers were paid, black troops soon proved themselves in battle. And they proved themselves with their lives. Their casualty rate was higher than that of white units. And that was partly because many of the captured black soldiers were killed on the spot. So we all know that Gettysburg is the turning point of the Civil War, but I do want to backtrack just a second. When McClellan was replaced, he was replaced by a guy with wonderful man chops, General Ambrose E. Burnside. And he differed from McClellan mainly in that he was not passive, he was an aggressive fighter. Granted, he had a disastrous attack at Fredericksburg that led to his replacement by General Joseph Hooker, whom Lee defeated at Chancellorsville. Again, just Lincoln's generals were not very good. Nevertheless, even though Lee won at Chancellorsville, it cost the Confederates dearly, and their losses were roughly equal to those of the Union forces, and of course harder to replace than the Union. In addition, Stonewall Jackson was killed in that battle by his own men who mistaked him for an outsider. So to make matters worse, the war in the West was really not going well for the Confederacy. So Lee needed this victory, and he decided that he would once again invade the North. And this time he would be facing Union General George Meade, who was now commanding the whole Union Army. And so Lee concentrated his army around the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And he awaited the approach of General Meade's forces. And so day 1, July 1st, 1863, the Confederates were able to push back against Union lines. Day 2, Lee strikes the Union flanks and leads to heavy fighting at Devil's Den. And the Southerners were able to actually capture Devil's Den and the Peach Orchard in Gettysburg, but ultimately failed to dislodge Union defenders. And on the 3rd day, fighting raged at Culp's Hill, and the Union was able to regain its lost ground. So after being cut down by a massive artillery bombardment in the afternoon, Lee attacked the Union center on Cemetery Ridge and was repulsed in what is now known as Pickett's Charge. And so Lee's second invasion of the North failed miserably and resulted in heavy casualties. There's an estimated 51,000 soldiers who were killed, wounded, captured, or listed as missing after Gettysburg. So Lee retreated after losing a major battle, maybe for the first time in his life, and as Union generals do, Meade never pressed his advantage. And again, maybe the war could have been ended here. We'll never know. But Meade failed to follow up the advantage. So toward the second half of the war, Lincoln finally found his guy, his general that would work as a great Union general, and that was General Grant, who had previously been demoted but proved himself in the second half of the war. And Grant was basically given a second chance to assume command of Union troops in the West when General Halleck, who he was forced to be under, was called back east in July 1862. And so while Gettysburg was going on, Grant was executing a daring series of maneuvers that led to the Confederate surrender at Vicksburg, Mississippi. And so Grant's victory gave the Union control of the Mississippi River and effectively split the Confederacy in half. And so if you'll remember, this was part of the Anaconda Plan, 1, to capture Richmond, and 2, to split the Confederacy in half by seizing control of the Mississippi River and cutting off supplies from east to west. And so after Grant won another decisive victory at Chattanooga, Lincoln promoted him to lieutenant general and gave him supreme command of the armies of the United States. And so we'll pick up tomorrow, or in the next video, with the economic and social effects of the war in the North and the South. And we'll look at women in the war and the surrender of Lee, and then what the effects of the war were.